Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, or even good evening, depending in which part of the world's time zones you're joining us today. Thank you very much for joining this Perth US Asia Centre webinar, launching our new publication, Enhancing Australia's Engagement in the Indian Ocean. I'm Dr. Kate O'Shaughnessy. I'm the Head of Research here at the Perth US Asia Centre. And while it's always a pleasure to launch our publications, I'm particularly pleased, as most recently Australia's former High Commissioner to Mauritius, to be launching this very timely publication. Many of you joining us on the webinar today will already be acutely aware of the strategic significance of the Indian Ocean. It's host to some of the world's fastest growing economies. Its sea lanes are absolutely critical to global trade, and the security of the region matters to the world. What this publication does is provide a regional perspective about the region from the region. I'm really pleased today to be joined by four of the report's authors. The editor of the publication, Perth US Asia Centre's Policy Fellow, James Bowen, who leads our work on climate change and regional engagement. By Dr. Pramesha Saha, who's a fellow at India's Observer Research Foundation, working in their Strategic Studies program. By Professor Lailufar Yasmin, who's Professor of International Relations at the University of Dhaka in Bangladesh. And by Ms. Sumati Permal, who's a Senior Fellow and Head of the Centre for Maritime Security and Diplomacy at the Maritime Institute of Malaysia. So this promises to be a very rich discussion, and I'm really looking forward to hearing from James as the report's editor and each of these authors, and I know that they're looking forward to discussing the report's contents with all of you during the question and answer session. So I'd like to hand over to get things started to, first of all, James Bowen, the report's editor, to set some of the context for our discussion today. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much, Kate. And I just want to thank firstly all the other participants on the panel and the remaining authors, so that we had 8 chapters in total for the publication who contributed to the report. I also want to thank the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, which supported this project. And a great big thanks to all those in the audience who are tuning in today, wherever you are in the world. So, as Kate mentioned, this report and the event today are all about recognising the importance of the Indian Ocean region to Australia's future foreign policy. And it was also about seeking to identify the main priorities for Australia's engagement in the region in terms of both the issues that need the most focus and the best ways of approaching them. So Kate has done a great job of introducing some of the economic and strategic importance of the Indian Ocean region. And I think that this report considers the region as presenting both opportunities and challenges. So, as Kate mentioned, the economic importance of the region comes from its fast-growing economies, its sea lines of communication, its importance to global energy trade and development, and strategically that we're seeing rising engagement around competition for access to some of those resources and supply chains, and around the desire to project military power. So this project is firmly rooted in Perth US Asia Centre's mission, which is so much of our focus is determined by our location on the west coast of Australia, looking up and outward to South and Southeast Asia, and the key opportunities and challenges of this region that we look towards. And that's really a different perspective to what a lot, if not most of the foreign policy community in Australia adopts. But it's critical to our overall security and prosperity, as I mentioned, and that's been increasingly recognised in the centralisation of the Indo-Pacific concept in national thinking in the past 5 to 10 years. So in preparing this report, I and others at the Perth US Asia Centre, we're also really conscious, as Kate mentioned, that our own perspectives can often suffer from a sort of observer bias. So we knew that if we wanted to really understand an area as large and as complex as the Indian Ocean region, then we really needed to rely on perspectives from the region itself. So we went out to authors either from or focus on 8 key countries in the nearest part of the Indian Ocean region to Australia in both South and Southeast Asia, which is consistent with Australia's broader Indo-Pacific strategy. And we asked them to identify key issues and some of the best channels through which Australia could engage on those issues, particularly in contexts that went beyond bilateral frameworks. So I think that the best way to get a sense of the diversity of the perspectives in the region is obviously to listen to the subsequent speakers and to read all of the individual chapters in the report. But I, as the editor of this report, also undertook a bit of a process of synthesizing the contributions to try and get the meat of what was being suggested and help inform Australian policy making. So the report authors raised numerous different issues on which Australia could engage, but I think there were 4 broad concerns that resonated to some degree across most or all jurisdictions surveyed. So those were infrastructure, climate change, blue economy, and maritime security. So the report recommends that Australia engage on these issues through existing institutions and processes, and where necessary, develop new mechanisms for responding to those issues. So one example is forming new partnerships for infrastructure development with higher capacity regional countries that might help to serve broader regional needs. So an example would be forming a Southeast Asian focused partnership with Singapore, or a South Asian focused partnership with India, and Pramesha, the next speaker, I think will probably touch on a little bit of that capacity. And the report authors also identified obstacles that Australian policymakers will need to overcome to enhance engagement with the Indian Ocean region. So I found it useful to divide those obstacles into 3 broad categories. So the first one is really around managing the complex regional power balance. So that phenomenon incorporates some challenges that will be familiar to policymakers and observers of Australian foreign policy elsewhere. So it includes the need to balance our closeness to the US and some sense of our pushback against China with the generally non-aligned or neutral preferences of other countries in the region. But it also covers a particularly complex relationship that many Indo-Pacific states have around India, particularly in South Asia. So India is an increasingly close partner to Australia. And we've also often directed a lot of our regional diplomacy, our regional outreach in the Indian Ocean through India. And that makes a lot of sense. But we also need to pay close attention to the more complex political and historical relations that others in the region have with India. So I think that the second major challenge to Australia is around the lack of well-resourced and fit-for-purpose institutional architecture in the Indian Ocean necessary to respond to the opportunities that I've outlined and the authors have outlined, and to manage some of the tensions that I've alluded to as well. So numerous groupings have Indian Ocean relevance, but none of them are sufficiently inclusive in terms of membership or the issues they cover, or the levels of commitments necessary to satisfy Australia's needs, to cater to the opportunities we can pursue in the region or manage those challenges. And the third and major challenge is essentially around the lack of a cohesive regional identity. So this report and the contributions to it identified that there were numerous issues and concerns with broad geographic salience, but by and large, the responses to them or the consideration of those issues continued to happen on a sub-regional level. So South Asia and Southeast Asia tended to operate as more contained ecosystems, and Australia was a bit at the periphery. And that's to say nothing of the Indian Ocean areas further to the west of India, which this report didn't survey for reasons, as I said, to be consistent with Australia's Indo-Pacific strategy. But that's perhaps a longer term project of some broader process of Indian Ocean regionalism. So I just want to close with some of the key recommendations around how Australia might respond to those obstacles that were outlined. So to manage the regional power balance in the report, I recommended that Australia pursue engagement based on 2 key principles. And one was to seek as best as possible to engage in a way that minimised great power competition or contestation between China and the US and its allies, while simultaneously acting independent of India as much as possible, but at the same time respectful of its regional importance. So that implies a bit of evolution to the current policy that Australia has adopted in the region. Now, to manage the institutional deficit, the report recommended that Australia engage in a really intensive stock take of its engagement with Indian Ocean regional bodies to help determine where improvements might be necessary. So that includes focusing on groups like the Indian Ocean Rim Association, the South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation, ASEAN to the extent that it engages in the Indian Ocean, the Quad with India, Japan, the United States, and also nascent relationships like the Australia-India-Indonesia trilateral. And finally, the recommendation are made around the lack of a cohesive Indian Ocean identities, that Australian policymakers should really centralise that attention to that to build more of a regional identity that promotes Indian Ocean regionalism, incorporating South Asia, Southeast Asia, and Australia and their concerns. So thanks for that. And I'm just going to now throw to the first author contributor today, who is Pramesha Saha at the Observer Research Foundation, who wrote the chapter on India to elaborate a bit more about her chapter and her thoughts on this project.
Sorry, thank you, James. Thank you, Kate. You've actually laid the groundwork very well. So since I have 5 minutes, I'll quickly make a few points. I'll start off from where James actually ended, that the very first thing that we need to look at is how the India-Australia relationship, I would say probably in the last 5 years, has evolved. That in itself, and that has evolved in the context of the Indo-Pacific. But when we talk of a free and open Indo-Pacific, we have to remember that it's a confluence of two oceans. Focus on the whenever there have been discussions on the Indo-Pacific, the focus has been primarily on the Eastern Indian Ocean and the Western and the South Pacific. And that was also a concern when we used to speak of what are the convergences between, say, India and US's policies in the Indo-Pacific, because for a long time, US's Indo-Pacific geography used to end at India's west coast. And India's primary interest, when we talk of the Indian Ocean, has been, as we term it, the Western Indian Ocean, and Australia terms it as Northeast Indian Ocean. It has been on our Western Indian Ocean because most of our South Asian neighbors are in the geographically based in the Western Indian Ocean region. So not only in terms of Indian Ocean diplomacy, in terms of our neighborhood diplomacy, the neighborhood first diplomacy also, it is only logical that India's interest primarily lies in the Western Indian Ocean. That is not to say that the Eastern Indian Ocean is of any less importance, but if I have to weigh it, maybe, it would be a little 1 or 2%, it would be a little more towards the Western Indian Ocean. So that is one point. The second, if I have to look at, is Australia currently is also engaging a lot with Indian Ocean littorals. But there has been a problem when we talk of, say, the Western Indian Ocean and Northeast Indian Ocean. Most countries actually think that just engaging with India is enough when you talk of engaging with that part of the Indian Ocean. But it is not so. There are many other island nations like Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Maldives, Seychelles, which also needs equal engagement. And that island diplomacy, that engaging the Western Indian Ocean is important. It can't just be aimed at with India. So what can be done is that there has to be the two countries, since we're talking about India, Australia here, the two countries need to work in tandem when we talk of island diplomacy in the Western Indian Ocean. And I think there are things that India can also gain from Australia's experience, because Australia also engages in island diplomacy when we talk of the South Pacific. So there can be in ways where both can learn from each other's experiences, because both are immediate neighborhood, requires us to engage in that kind of diplomacy. And most of the island nations face similar kind of challenges, as you mentioned: climate change, sea level rise, climate-induced maritime security challenges, natural disasters, which requires a resilient infrastructure building. So the challenges are a little similar, but so that gives us the opportunity to learn from each other's experiences. And in both these geographies, there have been a growing Chinese influence as well. So how, say, for example, Australia is tackling that, working with like-minded countries. India similarly is trying to do that, also working with like-minded countries. Though I agree, for long India, in 2015, I think I mentioned in the report itself, where Prime Minister Modi did mention that it's time for India to also work with other countries in the Indian Ocean, and keep in mind that, there are many countries, resident and non-resident, who have stakes in this region as well. So there is a need to work with like-minded countries to ensure that that this region is free of great power, is not home to such great power contestations, and there is peace and security all around. So that recognition has come from India's end, but the fact that India is a net security provider in the region, and that I'm saying mostly in relation to how India has responded to challenges and natural disasters and other kinds of challenges. For example, the recent one, the COVID, when we were under the COVID era, and how India's Vaccine Maitri initiative that was deployed, which was under our Security and Growth for All initiative. So there have been ways in which India has tried to be the first responder when it comes to crises in this region. And that is where I think that is a leverage which Australia would have, because given that India-Australia has very strong relations and there is some amount of trust, there is great amount of trust when we talk from the Indian policymakers that Australia would not overshadow India's influence in this region, as you rightly mentioned. So there are ways in which especially India can work with, I would not only say Australia, but there are other countries like Japan as well, some Southeast Asian countries like Indonesia as well, to work in this region. Saying that, and I think since I have just 5 minutes, I'll end with saying that we have to also remember, as you said, that what kind of relations India has with these neighbors also. So I think there are challenges in our South Asian diplomacy that India is facing at the moment. So there is a need to build more trust, and that can happen through bottom-up approaches, and then from that move on to top-down approaches. So start with issues like climate change, search and rescue, humanitarian assistance, disaster resilience, environmental security, and then move, because we are already doing a lot of maritime domain awareness, building the coastal surveillance capacity, and then from that probably move to more concrete security issues that would in a way lay the groundwork. If we from the beginning target strong security issues, that might be a little bit of a difficult it would not be as smooth as we would expected it to be. So start with these issues and then move upwards. So that I think would be a right way to move ahead. So with that, I would stop, and I'm happy to take on questions and observations during the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pramesha. That was fantastic. And I think I really do love the way you've highlighted the fact that the Australian and Indian perspectives are evolving simultaneously. And this does create opportunities for us to actually cooperate on a number of areas that we haven't traditionally in the Indian Ocean region. I will return to some of those points in the open conversation, but we'll first hear from Laila Yasmin to speak on the Bangladeshi perspective. And I think that's really a great segue in the sense that we've spoken a bit about India's centrality and some of the complexities that arise from that. So a Bangladeshi perspective is fantastic in this context. Just currently on mute, Laila, if you could. Thank you.
Oh, thank you for reminding me after so many years of webinar, I still forget to unmute myself. Thank you, James. Thank you, our colleagues, and thank you, Perth US Asia Center, for giving me this opportunity to talk about Bangladesh. As James mentioned, this report is about the region, from the region, and this part is something that I applaud a lot, because Bangladesh often is seen at the periphery of international events, which it is not, and gradually gaining a strategic importance that no longer can be put aside. As we can see, one of the other Australian scholars, David Brewster, he famously pointed out how Bangladesh is emerging middle power, and he was here a few months back, and he spoke with my students and said that no, Bangladesh is no longer a rising middle power, but it is already a middle power, especially, and something that I argue as well, especially when it comes to setting agenda in international politics from his perspective, and that is why our engagement and where Bangladesh's viewpoints to be articulated for the international audience. So Bangladesh is sitting at the mouth of the Bay of Bengal and is an important country geopolitically. It has a couple of advantages and disadvantages. Advantages is that we are situated beside India, we are situated beside Myanmar, and that is exactly our disadvantage as well to manage two big countries, and especially when we share the fifth largest land border with India, that becomes often challenging. So in my report, I pointed out what are the areas from Indian Ocean's perspective that Bangladesh needs cooperation with Australia. Bangladesh needs sort of mutual understanding with India. As previously my colleague from India pointed out, building trust and how to look at this building of relationship as a bottom-up approach. That is something I also spoke in my paper. As we can see that we are talking on the same sort of line and from the same mindset that we need need to build a lot of trust and understanding in this region about each other's role, about each other's contribution. For Bangladesh in particular, what we need is that to create some kind of mechanism where in case of maritime security, in case of the challenges emanating due to non-traditional security threats, for example, piracy in the Bay of Bengal region, because Bay of Bengal is the largest bay in the world and also the second important hotspot in the entire Indian Ocean region, something that we often forget. So how can we have collaborative effort with Sri Lanka, Maldives, India, and all these countries, and how we can sort of talk about building infrastructure. So another, a couple of areas that I pointed out, that we have existence of a dead zone in the Bay of Bengal, which is the second largest dead zone in the world. So these are some of the areas where we need regional partnership, regional infrastructure building, regional knowledge sharing, as well as countries like Australia to come forward, provide us with technical assistance. Then, of course, we have something that I often mention, that none of the South Asian countries, including India, we do not have deep sea fishing capacity, something that may sound very minute, but this has a huge implication. Look at the North Sea, look at the sea around Japan, they're running out of fishes, whereas, one of the Indian admirals who came in Dhaka in 2007 famously pointed out that that fishes in the Indian Ocean are dying because of old age, because we do not have the technology to catch them. So these are some of the areas that in the South Asian countries we can cooperate, we can collaborate, we can encourage from the government to our business community. And this is where Australia's know-how, because we hear famous stories about Australian cricketers going out there and catching fishes in the sea. So all of these issues, we have a lot of commonalities, but we often find it difficult to merge, to understand how to merge those and work together. So these are some of the areas that I have pointed out. I've also pointed out increasingly that as I said in the beginning, that how Bangladesh has the potential to act as a geographical sort of connection with the Northeast India, with Nepal and with Bhutan. But here I also pointed out that we do not have transit facilities to go to Nepal or Bhutan. Rather, there's transshipment opportunity given by India. So the kind of regional identity we are talking about building, which is very important, that having an Indian Ocean identity, that cannot work out as long as we do not have that mistrust, suspicion. These are removed from our bilateral relations as well as multilateral relations. Therefore, I mean, I identified what are the institutional architecture that we need to build, and what are the ways that we can create this maritime domain awareness in this region. And that is where both our South Asian partners, especially India, as well as how Australia can help us to achieve those particular sort of areas. And I'll be happy to take on questions, and there are a lot of issues that we can also sort of discuss and be mutually benefited by learning from each other. And thank you once again for giving Bangladesh this platform to voice its opinion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lailafa. I think that's framing around Bangladesh as an emerging middle power is really apt, and it goes to, I think, what a lot of we say in terms of the Indo-Pacific. The rise of this region, or the rise of Asia, tends to over-focus on one or two countries, particularly China. And the broader message in our region, I think, is we need to look at other Southeast Asian countries from an Australian perspective. But we really do need to be paying more attention to South Asia as well. So I think that's really, really great. And I like your emphasis on technical capacity that Australia might provide as well. And we'll return to some of those things, I think, in the chat in a little bit. Thank you. So turning now to Samarthi Permal, who has a bit of a Southeast Asian perspective, but also owing to her position, her expertise, really an interest in the maritime space, which is really what the prominence of the Indian Ocean region is about, and what the Indo-Pacific in a larger sense is about. So Samarthi, if you can give us a bit of an overview of your contribution to the report and some of your broader thoughts.
Thank you so much, James Bowen, and also Kate, and also to Perth US Asia Center, and congratulations for successfully launching of the report, and also inviting Nima, myself, to write a chapter. So my chapter essentially to discuss about how Australia, Malaysia, and engagement on the maritime domain has been, and also what are the critical issues confronting the Indian Ocean region, and how we can address it for future functional activities. So Malaysia's maritime domain is situated in the confluence of Indian and Pacific Ocean. So this is very strategic for Malaysia, and our economic is highly dependent from the sea. Not only the living, but also the non-living resources. We have oil and gas interests. We host Malaysia together with Indonesia and Malaysia, host the strategic sea lanes of communication, the Straits of Malacca, that is very important, slot in the Indo-Pacific region. Also hosting many important ports along the Straits of Malacca, which is critical for Malaysia's economic development. So Malaysia's interest in the Indian Ocean is basically divided into, for the purpose of this chapter, I have focused on three important areas. One is the maritime economic for trade and food security. Secondly, ocean governance, and thirdly, the asymmetric maritime security threats in view of the geopolitics, geostrategic contest that is ongoing in the region. So when you focus on maritime economic, I think the Southeast Asia region, or the Asian region, is one of the thriving region. As combined, Southeast Asian countries have more than 40% of economic interest arising from the sea. So as I said, the confluence of economic and strategic interest at sea, it's very much a priority for a country like Malaysia. And also food security. When you talk about food security, that there are many elements to it. One is to ensure that we have a sustainable food in the future, in line with the UN Sustainable Development Goals, as well as food security. We are able to address the problem of food security. That's some of the most important issues like we would like to discuss or engage Australia. Secondly, on ocean governance, when you talk about ocean governance, there are new issues apart from traditional or non-traditional maritime security that we have addressed in the past, like piracy and border-based security, like non-traditional smuggling of people, goods, arrival of boat people at sea, and so on. But there are new emerging security challenges, such as digitalization of port and digitalization of the shipping industry itself, and the cyber security threats rising from that Malaysia have not been really able to address. And this is some of the new areas that countries in the Indian Ocean have to work together because of the supply, the connectivity and the supply chain that is highly globalized. The second issue within the ocean governance is to have awareness, and also the importance, the significance of having a healthy ocean. That is one of the focus for under Malaysia's Sustainable Development Goals, where we are trying to ensure that there are adequate support, technical and capacity support towards that goal. Meaning that we want to receive more resource and technical expertise from Australia or Indian Ocean nation to support marine spatial planning, for example, or issues of new adaptation towards the climate change, the rising level of sea temperature and so on, and how it is affecting coastal cities in Southeast Asia. And the third issue that I've discussed in the chapter is asymmetric security challenges arising not only the non-traditional security, but also in the wider context of the big power rivalry between US and China that has been on the background, where countries have to very carefully be selective of what sort of engagement we take part in the Indian Ocean region. Of course, when you talk about the wider Indo-Pacific, ASEAN Outlook stands as a foremost important document that set up the basis for cooperation with Indo-Pacific countries. But I'm also happy that the recent meeting on the IORA, Indian Ocean Rim Association, have also adopted Indo-Pacific Outlook that could set up some framework of more deeper engagement with countries like India, Australia, Japan, and so on in the wider Indo-Pacific region. So I think I will stop here. Maybe we will discuss more during the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sumarti. That was fantastic. And as I said, I really appreciate your maritime perspective. And I think that this is clearly an area where Australia and Malaysia have convergence of interest. And perhaps Australia, we don't think of ourselves as a maritime country enough, and we don't engage with those issues so much as we should. And I think that has greater salience as well for what Lalafa was saying as well around capacity around fishing, for example. Blue economy, as I said, was one of the major issues that came out of this report as being a priority for the region. So I just want to remind people, if anybody does want to raise a question for any of the panelists, and myself included, feel free to put them into the chat. We'll get to those in a second. We'll have a bit of a broader conversation, but I have a few individual questions for the panelists at the moment that I'll sort of open up the conversation with, and then we'll perhaps turn to some of those other questions. So Prameswara, I wanted to return to you. I know that you've written a bit and thought a bit about the significance of the Indonesia-Australia India trilateral. And for a while, that partnership seemed to be dormant, but there was a bit of a reconvening at the recent UN General Assembly, and there's a bit more attention paid to that partnership. And I think in the process of thinking about regionalism, how do we unite South Asia, Southeast Asia, Australia, and respond to those common issues and challenges? This is a really promise-filled partnership, but probably doesn't get the resourcing or the attention that it deserves. So I wonder if you could give us your thoughts on where that partnership is, or what might be the priorities in developing it further.
Yes, thank you, James. See, the India-Australia-Indonesia trilateral has been existent for quite some time, but it was restricted to the level, I won't say restricted, but it was limited to the level of the senior officials meeting, the SOM level, basically. And but there has been a lot of appetite, especially from Australia and to some extent even India's end, when we talk about elevating this to a higher level, to the level of, say, the foreign ministers, for instance. But there has been some hesitation from Indonesia's side, because there is this perception sometimes, which we, when a bilateral relationship goes very well, sometimes there is lack of realization, then why is there a need, say, for a trilateral initiative to come about? Because that was what was a voice that we were hearing from the Indonesian perspective, from the Indonesian side, that the India-Indonesia relationship is moving smoothly. The Australia-Indonesia relationships is also moving ahead. Then why is there a need for the three countries to come about? And also we are engaged in multilateral platforms like IORA, for instance, if we are talking about Indian Ocean diplomacy and stuff like that. But what needs to be seen is when we talk of Indian Ocean, these three countries are very important. As Sumati also rightly pointed out, that Indonesia, Malaysia, they are home, they border these critical sea lanes of communication. Indonesia, for instance, also Sunda, Lombok, Makassar, Omboy, Wetar, all these other straits, which are also critical when we talk of the Indian Ocean, right? So I think though this meeting happened along the sidelines of UNGA, one needs to understand that also there was no statements that came out of this meeting. There were just simple tweets from the foreign ministers. So if one doesn't follow them, they would not even know that such a meeting has happened in the first place. So, there is a need now to keep the momentum going. And that is where I think you need to channel out the issues which are of importance. Otherwise, this can just be a one-off thing and be it. That's it. But I think for that, I think maritime security plays a very important role, because if you see Indonesia's recent statements, even in along the sidelines of G20, when there were meetings with other, with Australia or India, they did talk about maritime security. They did talk about, IORA, for instance, besides other issues like climate change, SDGs, and other issues. But since our discussion is on maritime, they did talk about maritime security in a big way. And I think that in itself, maritime law enforcement, for example, I think these are areas, especially when we talk about if we have to keep this trilateral moving, I think maritime security, capacity building, focus on coast guards to begin with, because say the Indonesian Coast Guard is a very new establishment. Bakamla is fairly new, and they do need capacity building and training. So I think that is where India and Australia can play a role. Then when we are talking about maritime domain awareness, for example, India's Information Fusion Center is there. We already have liaison officers from Australia, France, UK. There is a need, even from Singapore, there is a need to bring in liaison officers from Indonesia, Malaysia also, for instance. So bring, make maritime domain awareness can happen to maritime fusion centers. That is one mechanism. Other is the AIS, but maritime fusion center is a good way to begin. Then you have the ASEAN Humanitarian Preparedness Center. I think that is where also India and Australia can learn from Indonesia's experience, because Indonesia is host to natural disasters, but they also have a resilient, they are very resilient. So in those ways, when we are talking about island diplomacy, it's a good opportunity to learn from Indonesia's experience. So that is where I think India and Australia can also draw some lessons from Indonesia. So there are areas in which you can, talk about, and that's what when we were talking about Ben, Evan, Natalie, we were drawing out areas about how we can, and I think maritime law enforcement, maritime diplomacy, and illegal fishing, as even Yasmin pointed out and Sumati pointed out, these are important areas also to look at. So you don't just have to always focus on China and the Great Power competition when you talk of the maritime domain. There are many other areas where one can look into, and if you have to join a country like Indonesia and keep their interest intact, that is where you have to head and not talk about this US-China contestation, because I think that is where Southeast Asian countries have repeatedly pointed out that we should not be forced to take sides. So keep that discussion aside, which makes them think that they're taking a side, and talk about the other issues which are also critical, to keep such initiatives going.
Thank you so much. I think that's a really critical point. We shouldn't approach a multitude of regional issues through that great power lens. So I want to actually turn to Sumathi on this, because I know that you did actually make that point in your chapter as well, that, and this is a broader Southeast Asian concern that we hear a lot around the need for engagement for external partners like Australia to help take the edge off that US-China competition, and to retain some sense of neutrality around these sort of issues that we are dealing with. So can you perhaps elaborate on your views on that, and how it particularly relates to the Indian Ocean region, and what maybe recommendations in a bit more concrete terms that might lead to, Sumathi?
Okay. US and China are important partners for Southeast Asian countries. China is very important for economic purposes, and also China is very close to Southeast Asian countries. In the same regard, US is a major power. Malaysia, for example, we have a long-standing military cooperation with the US, and I think Southeast Asian engagement with these two powers is important. But there are so many maritime security issues and also ocean governance issues that requires requires more engagement or more intervention, I would say, from middle powers. So middle powers includes countries that have got deep interest on the SLOC and also maritime domain. So I think Japan has been, Japan is a stakeholders in the Straits of Malacca. China is a stakeholders, and also Australia. Australia have many long-term engagement with Malaysia, Indonesia, and other Indian Ocean countries. But I think in recent days, the geopolitical contests have been also in the binary of how this middle power are taking sides or engaging these two powers in order to engage smaller Southeast Asian countries. So this is what I think the main problem is. When you look at IORA, for example, I think IORA have been existent for more than 2 decades or so, and NEMA have actually participated in IORA's Indian Ocean Rings projects, programs, and we have hosted many working groups to identify issues for Indian Ocean nations. And we have identified the fishing issues, the level of the climate change adaptation, and many other non-traditional security issues. But the last 10 years or so, most of these functional activities are not being able to be effectively carried on because of the focus, the exaggerated US-China contest, and how it has shaped and influenced other powers' engagement in this region. But having said that, since the Australia, Japan, and many other countries like France, beyond the Indian Ocean, have come up with the Indo-Pacific strategies that include more, a far-reaching approach to the maritime domain that is quite inclusive of all these issues, especially focusing on ocean governance and trying to dilute the great powers strategic contest to engage smaller, like Bangladesh, Maldives, Mauritius, and so on, including. I would give a very simple, very quickly on G20, the recent meeting in G20. It is a meeting of the maritime, the economic powers of the world. So the idea is this economic power would help to induce the economy of in a global economy in the wake of COVID-19 and so on. But when you look at the actual outcome of the G20s, most of the discussion were not really, the sideline meetings were quite successful because of the meeting of President Biden and Xi Jinping. But when you look at the actual statements and the actual outcome of the G20, I think there are very little achievement as to how these countries are going to induce or help recover the post-pandemic economy of the world. So what I'm appealing to the countries like Australia, Japan, and so on is to focus more on how Southeast Asian countries can revive their own economies from the COVID-19 pandemic, and to focus on to revive the economies, for example, maritime tourism, marine spatial planning, the impact of climate change. These are some of the newer issues that requires a lot of expertise from Australia, Japan, and even Korea, for example. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think that actually leads on to another question that you actually partially answered one of the questions that we had from Gordon Flake, who's the CEO of the Perth US Asia Centre in the conversation, which was around seeking the panel's perspectives on non-littoral countries in the Indian Ocean. So you mentioned Japan. Also, would appreciate perhaps Laila if you can provide a bit of insight around Bangladesh's perspective or the regional perspective on how countries external to the Indian Ocean might play a bigger role, and are there existing partnerships or platforms that are particularly useful in that, and areas where that might be useful?
Thank you, James. This is actually a very interesting question when we see United States, China, Europe as non-littoral. But in another sense, I was just searching when this question came, that when the Asia Pacific, this broader framework is to be the way to introduce the region. This region is home to 4.3 billion people, like half the population of the world. And China is, of course, not an Indo-Pacific country, but it has strong interest, as pointed out by my colleagues before in the Malacca Strait. So has Japan, so has Korea, so has the United States of America, because that is why we see Bangladesh also trying to forge a relationship with a number of countries who may be geographically away from us, but are equally important in a developing partnership. Just a few days back, we had the first Bangladesh-EU political dialogue taking place, and this is a recognition from the side of the European Union how Bangladesh's previous role is changing pretty fast, because Bangladesh is by 2030 is going to emerge as one of the top 10 consumer markets in the world. Not to add with that is that Bangladesh is the most populous country in the world. It might be a small geography, but and its location, all of this together has made European Union, United States of America, Japan, Korea, China, all of these countries to pay special attention to Bangladesh, because it is no longer a aid recipient country, but it's rather a trade dependent country. So whatever happening in other side of the world, that impacts Bangladesh. That if anything happens to the global supply chain, this affects Bangladesh's export, because Bangladesh experiences a specific dilemma that our export destinations are Australia, European Union, United States, but our import come from China, India, and all of these countries. So we have no other way but to critically look at the relationship and the great power rivalry that is unfolding. And this is where we take a pretty clear stand by saying that that's other countries to figure out. For us, we need to have a healthy relationship with all the countries of the world, and that is why Bangladesh, and as I think someone pointed out, neutral stances that is pursued by a number of Southeast Asian and South Asian countries. It is to say out loud that we are not supporting anyone. We are not getting into in any kind of crisis that is unfolding in brewing in different parts of the world, because nowadays we can see, especially after COVID, we have not only as human beings, but countries have become also quite intolerant of each other. So therefore, I see that how Bangladesh's geopolitical significance is being recognized by partners. Japan, for example, Japan has started sending experts from Bangladesh so that they learn about Japan and they disseminate this information about Japan's foreign policy. I, for example, in September was invited by MOFA Japan, and I went there and met with some of the very important decision makers. For example, with the president of the board who is formulating Japan's new ODA policy, and all of them, they understand how Bangladesh is important. They understand how Japan needs to see this world from a very a Japanese perspective, where its interest need to be recognized by its partners in South Asia. Japan is, by the way, is one of our largest ODA donor. So we need to understand this from different countries' perspective as well as regional perspective, instead of, as Dr. Shaha pointed out, that it should be a bottom-up approach. And when we are talking about states in the global the way perspectives, we need to come to the states instead of looking at it from great powers perspective. So I would emphasize that and therefore and that is why this report was very significant, because it involved from the region about the region, and this is something that I really appreciate. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and I really appreciate your focus on Bangladesh's evolution, as we say, from an aid-dependent to a trade-dependent country, and I think that that evolution of the region was really reflected in a few different contributions, including the Thai chapter as well, around potential for Thailand to become an emerging donor country to its region as well, and how does that open up new relationships between Australia and Thailand. I think that is something that we might look to as being a new frontier of Australian policymaking in the region. So I just want to stay on Lalifa just for a second, because I had a question from Dr. Troy Lee Brown, who's at the Defence and Security Institute here at the University of Western Australia, where we're based. And it was around BIMSTEC, so a really long, complicated name for the Bay of Bengal Initiative for Multi-Sectoral Technical and Economic Cooperation, an institution that has some great Bangladeshi salience. So his question was around on maritime security. Is it advantageous to expand institutions such as BIMSTEC to include Southeast Asian states like Malaysia, Indonesia, Singapore? And he also had a question about the advantages of expanding the Colombo Security Conclave to include new members, or whether that might serve as a blueprint for similar multilateral initiatives in the Indian Ocean region. Do you have some thoughts on that?
Yes, thank you. Let me start with the Colombo Security Conclave first, and then I'm coming to BIMSTEC. Yes, here a lot of, because I recently concluded another publication on mapping out Bangladesh's opportunities and Bangladesh's challenges of the Bay of Bengal region broadly, which is going to be published very soon. It's a monograph containing around 30,000 words. So there we, emphasize that there are a couple of issues in the region that we need to take into account from the region instead of thinking about it from the outside of the region. For example, I pointed out what are the difficulties for Bangladesh to be a part of Colombo Security Conclave, that Bangladesh is at the moment is an observer state as a part of CSC. So what happens is that whenever there is the word security, and for this I actually interviewed a couple of scholars from Bangladesh and outside of Bangladesh, whenever there is this word security, we have a suspicion around any kind of alliance, any kind of cooperative framework, because Bangladesh is committed to non-alignment, Bangladesh is committed to not taking sides, Bangladesh is committed to be part of rather initiatives which emphasize on non-traditional security issues. So I understand CSC emphasizes on non-traditional security issues, but the word security is often interpreted in a very different manner in Bangladeshi discourse, and therefore I'm sure that a number of scholars coming from Bangladesh, they are quite apprehensive about what is the actual purpose. And having said that, there are scholars from outside of Bangladesh, whoever I spoke, either in Australia or in other regions, that why Bangladesh cannot cooperate in this region, and what are the impediments of cooperation in this region. As pointed out before, that is building regional trust and faith is something that we have to do regionally. There's no scope that there is no possibility that anyone from the outside can tell us to learn it from Europe, tell us to learn it from Northern Ireland, how they mended their fences. So this is something we have to really take active initiative to work on. And number two, BIMSTEC. Yes, BIMSTEC is a very, as again my Malaysian colleague pointed out, that IORA was established so many years back. BIMSTEC is also quite more than 25-year-old institution. What happened during the Cold War period, that it was mostly dysfunctional, and even now. In fact, it was established after the end of the Cold War, but even for the most part of its existence, it has been quite dysfunctional. But recently, we can see, at least in non-traditional areas, what BIMSTEC has very strategically taken up is that identifying issue and issue area leadership, so that a country can pursue the issue, take involving others, and it's not entirely on the organization. So I have hopes that this might work out in the future. However, one issue that I wanted to mention, before, is that I believe, my colleagues will be able to correct me if I'm wrong, that there is a lack of maritime search and rescue framework in Indo-Pacific region. I believe there is one in India, there is one in Singapore. Altogether in the Indo-Pacific region, at best, there are 3 maritime search and rescue, centers, and we need to pay attention while we're talking about the building technical assistance with Australia on this aspect. So this is something I would also like to flag on the side of the talk, that why we have so few maritime search and rescue centers, and what can be done bilaterally as well as multilaterally, and with the assistance of Australia. And also, it has been pointed out that that how India was not invited. I think Dr. Shaha can point out on this. I can see the question about CIDCA. I think Dr. Shaha can point this out. Thank you.
Professor Dr. Saha, do you want to respond to those couple of questions, prompts around lack of search and rescue capacity in the region, and perhaps around, which was mentioned around this recent event that China held, an Indian Ocean initiative, allegedly didn't invite India, and there was some controversy around Australia or other participants that particularly were invited. Do you want to respond to just those things quickly?
Yes, the Indian Ocean Conclave, which happened in Kunming recently, I think when we talk about India, China at the moment, I'm not. I don't think it's in the context of the Indian Ocean. I think right now India, in terms of statements, I would say India has been taking a rather strong stand, and it is important. I would very rightly, it is very much important to take that strong stand, because for long India had, India was still towing along the diplomatic lines when it came to its China policy, but the External Affairs Minister has in repeated platforms said that India-China relation is going through a difficult time, and especially after the Galwan Valley clash, there has been a breach of trust, and it would be difficult to get over. There have been clashes before. There was the Doklam clash, but even after that, you did see the Wuhan summit, you did see the Malalipuram summit, and India did try to solve the issues in a diplomatic manner. But obviously, the results were not as India was hoping. And the Galwan Valley clash was an eye opener. And I think currently, even for nationalistic, even for the Indian public opinion on China has gone through a huge change. ORF recently did a survey, a foreign policy poll survey, which we started from last year. And nearly 65 to 70% of our Indian youth has termed China as a threat to India's status as a rising power. And very little, and in terms of trust, China has been seen ranked at the end. So in those regards also, I think many ways, I think whenever there is an initiative which India takes, supposedly a stand which toes along Chinese lines, the Global Times comes up saying that, India and China are these Asian powers, and, they need to move away from the Western influence. But the problem is that anything India does is seen as towing the US line. That is another point of view, which China always makes it clear that anything, even with regards to Russia's stand, for example, which is very different from the other Quad countries. It was like, India and China rising, and Asian economies and whatever. But this fact that at least, even if you did not have to invite ministerial figures, but there could have been invites from other institutional bodies, for example, in the Indian Ocean Conclave, because we were talking on blue economy. What I saw, the discussions on the statements were on blue economy, marine ecology. So if there were no discussions on security, then it actually seems a little pointless not to invite India, because if you see India's recent Indo-Pacific Oceans Initiative, which India terms, as one of its Indo-Pacific policies, if you see all the 7 pillars, those 7 pillars are basically blue economy, marine ecology. You see very little on maritime security in terms of the hard terms, right? So in those regards also, I think the way that India is also trying to approach its Indo-Pacific policy, be it through SAGA or be it through IPOI, I think there was a need to involve India, because not only the fact that India is one of the leading powers in the Indian Ocean, but also the fact that I think it would also raise suspicions if you are looking to work with countries like Australia, Japan, though there are obviously, as was mentioned in the question, but even if you are looking to work with countries like, say, South Asia, if you don't invite a country like India, it again raises a question that is China again trying to bring in a great power competition involving India, China in this part, like it is doing with US, China on the other parts. So I think that made no sense, but I'm not sure. Maybe I'd read somewhere that there were some people from FICCI who were supposed to, our Federal Chamber of Commerce, who were supposed to attend it virtually. But right now in the Indian media, I have not read anything that came out from the Indian statements if they have attended something like this. But if they would have, I'm sure there would have been some media statements on those regards. But I think there were some speculations that at least people from the Federal Chamber of Commerce would be attending. But I don't think there was any such attendance happening. But I think it has to do broadly with how the India-China relations is progressing, not just in relation to the Indian Ocean.
Thank you so much. And as always happens, we've rapidly run out of time, and I think I need to move towards actually summing up the event. And but I just wanted to respond to one. Well, there's been a couple of questions as well around other countries in the region. So I want to close by basically outlining that this report, we've highlighted 3 countries, but we also have perspectives on the Maldives, on Sri Lanka, Indonesia, Singapore and Thailand. So I do encourage all readers or viewers today to actually to get a copy of the report, read more about these different regional perspectives. And I think that as we've seen today, there is the general thesis that the Indian Ocean region is important, has been proven that it is important to Australia. But there are some challenges, there are opportunities, and this is just the start of a conversation around how countries like Australia, countries like Malaysia, India, Bangladesh, and the others covered in this report can work together to foster a broader sense of Indian Ocean regionalism and work on some of those challenges going forward. So thank you everybody who tuned in today, and I really want to thank again Pramesha Saha, Samati Pamal, Laila Yasmin, and Kate O'Shaughnessy for introducing. Thank you very much for everybody.